Are you trying to learn jazz improvisation but struggling to keep track of your Dorian, Phrygian, and Mixolydian? Which scale goes over which chord again? Well, don't fret, no pun intended. I'm going to save you a ton of time and a huge headache with this next piece of advice. Take those modes and chuck them out the door. You don't need them. Don't believe me? Give me just a few minutes of your time and I will tell you exactly why. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Tim and I teach busy adult guitarists how to improvise creative jazz solos using simple concepts and a small amount of daily practice. The ideas we cover in this video are powerful and far-reaching. If you'd like to learn more about how to apply them to the songs and material you're working on at home, I have a few slots open for one-on-one sessions where we can do a deep dive into your playing to get you quickly moving past your soloing roadblocks and have you improvising with clarity and confidence. Click the link below. Now, conventional wisdom tells us that if we want to learn to improvise over jazz tunes, the place to start is with modes. There are hundreds of books, courses, and YouTube videos that deal specifically with the concept of using modes to learn improvisation. I was spoon-fed this little nugget myself when I went to Jazz University, which was a big waste of time, by the way. And I fell for it hook, line, and sinker. I sat in a lecture hall and dutifully recorded in my notebook all the instructions my professor dictated. If you want to shred over the 2 chord, use the Dorian mode. Moving up to the 5 chord, switch to the Mixolydian. When we reach the 1 chord, quickly dive back to your Ionian mode. Now I remember wondering while listening to Charlie Christian and Django shred over jazz standards, were they really thinking to themselves, Mixolydian, okay, now Aeolian, now back to Ionian, to Dorian. It seemed fantastically complicated, and I wondered just how many years it had taken them to be able to get through a single tune. But then again, maybe it was just me. Charlie and Django obviously had no trouble crafting beautiful solos. So why was I struggling with the concept? Why did it feel so jarring to have to keep multiple scales in my head and suddenly switch between them as the chords changed? Was I deficient somehow? I honestly began to wonder, maybe I just wasn't talented at jazz and I should just stick to cowboy chords. Sadly, it wasn't until several years after my college course, when I was playing professionally, that I learned the sad truth. I had been scammed by the system. After conversations with working pros, gleaning practice tips and advice, I realized that barely any of them talked about modes. After doing some research, I soon realized that virtually none of our jazz heroes learned to play using modes either. In fact, it's probably the least intuitive and most misleading approach that one could choose for learning how to improvise. No wonder I felt I was struggling. Now I know you may be doubting me. After all, what are my credentials? I'm just some dude on the internet. But I can back up my claim with some solid evidence. Please watch the following.
You know, I found out much later about modes and etc., all the stuff that's in they're teaching in college. And I had to know about it because I did wind up teaching in college. And at one point I ran the guitar program at University Arts. I realized that, wait a minute, I didn't learn how to play it like that. I didn't learn to play jazz like that. And I couldn't get kids to play. It didn't sound like jazz. It sounded like they went to school. I mean, how did Charlie Parker learn how to play? There was no schools. Les Montgomery could barely read music.
Yeah, let me tell you, never in my life, I never heard of anything about a Dorian or Mixolydian or Lydian. I ain't heard nothing, but I learned how to play jazz. I know all of you know about the Dorian and the Mixolydian. I know nothing about that nonsense. I ain't never heard of it in my life.
Okay, so we've heard it from some of the old school pros. Modes are not the way they learn jazz. We're now going to examine why modes can be misleading for beginners. Then we'll look at exactly how players like Jimmy and Barry learn their craft. Okay, modes are nothing but a conceptual way of thinking about a scale from different perspectives. We basically take a single scale, for example the major scale, and break it up into 7 individual scales beginning on each of the notes of the parent scale. We give each of these new scales Greek names like Ionian, Dorian, Lydian. We think of them as major or minor scales, with some of the notes in the scale modified from our usual major or minor scales. For example, the Lydian chord is like a regular old major scale, but with a sharpened fourth note. We also associate each of these new modes with a chord that we can play over. The 2 chord is a minor chord, and the second mode, or the Dorian, is the minor scale we can play over that. Now, to clarify, this is a perfectly suitable concept for thinking about the different tonalities of a major scale. It's just completely inimical to thinking about how to improvise jazz. Why is that? Because jazz songs are made of chords, and these chords can go by rather quickly. If we have a 7-note mode associated with each of these chords, and we have to switch between each mode as the chords are whipping by, you can imagine the chaos that ensues. I can remember as a young student literally jumping from the root of one mode to the root of the next mode as the chords changed, my phrases being decapitated in mid-sentence as I rapidly hunted for the next scale. My solo sounded like I was running scales up and down over each chord, as indeed I was. I also could make neither head nor tail of the fretboard. The scale position I'd been using had become a jumble of different fingerings, not a recipe for melodic playing. The other issue we have with modal playing is that of those 7 notes of the mode associated with each chord, not all of them are created equal. Some of the notes, say, of the Mixolydian mode will sound great over the 5 chord, but some will sound less great, and at least one of them will sound pretty awful. Now let's examine our problems on the fretboard in the context of a 2-5-1 progression in C major. Here's a C major scale in the G cage position beginning at the 8th fret of the bottom E string. Now for simplicity, let's look at the 3 modes associated with our chords in a single octave on the top strings. Our 2 chord is D minor 7, and we might know that the major scale mode associated with that is D Dorian. So here's D, our root note, at the 7th fret of the G string, and if we walk up, we get D, E, F, G, A, B, C. Our 5 chord is G7, and its mode is G Mixolydian. Here's our root note G at the 5th fret of the D string, and walking up, we get G, A, B, C, finally, our C major scale in C, otherwise known as the Ionian mode, begins here on the 5th fret of the G string and goes C, D, E, F, G, A, B, with the C on top for good measure. Now we've already encountered our first problem, which is overcomplication. For each of our chords, we now have the number system, which tells us the function of the chord, i.e. the 2 chord. Then we have the actual name of the chord, D minor 7, and we also have the associated mode, which is Dorian. This is information overload. Our second problem is that with the 7 notes now associated to each chord, all of which come from the major scale, how do we orient ourselves when improvising over a chord progression? What happens when the chords change and we need to switch to our next group of 7 notes? How do we form a link from one mode to the next? And how do we make sense of the fretboard beneath our fingers? The unfortunate answer is that when improvising with modes, particularly as beginners, we tend to want to orient ourselves around the root notes of each mode, meaning that as we're playing D Dorian, for example, as the chord changes from D minor 7 to G7, we instinctively want to jump down to our root note G to reposition ourselves. Now, this orientation around root notes makes for some very choppy playing and hinders our ability to craft melodies that flow from one chord to the next. We end up just running scales up and down, switching to the root note of the next scale as the chords change. It sounds something like this. Not great. Our third problem with mode-based improvisation is that out of the 7 notes in any given mode, not all of them are equally useful. In each mode, there are some notes that are suitable for creating strong melody, and there are some that aren't. Some notes even clash with the underlying chords. Now, if I play the 4th notes of each mode over the chords that lie beneath, you'll hear exactly what I mean. Okay, so if using modes to improvise creates mental overwhelm, fretboard disorientation, uninspired scale-like lines that revolve around root notes, and indistinct melodic ideas, why do we use this approach? And what's the solution to this modal mayhem? The answer is chord tones. Now, what are chord tones? Literally, the notes that form a chord. You might already know that every chord is made up of at least 3 notes using a specific formula: root, third, and fifth. For example, if we look at the D minor 7 chord, starting with the root note D, if we take the third note away from D, and then the fifth note away, that gives us D, F, A D minor chord. This 3-note chord is called a triad. We can do the same thing for our 5 chord. Starting on G and taking the third and fifth notes away from G, we get G, E, D, forming a G major triad. Finally, starting on C, for our 1 chord, we take the root, third, and fifth notes, which gives us a C major triad, C, E, and G. The 3 notes that comprise each triad are our chord tones. Because these chord tones outline the chords themselves, they're natural contenders to use in our improvisations to create strong melodies over the changes we're playing. If you improvise with chord tones, you sometimes don't even need a band or another instrument playing the chords underneath to hear the harmony. It's strongly implied by the chord tones themselves. Now, this is the key to sounding coherent when you improvise, instead of sounding like you're just running scales up and down. So, to summarize, instead of having a 7-note mode associated with each chord, we've simplified by having just 3 strong notes to play. Many solos from the early days of jazz by players like Louis Armstrong or Buddy Bolden were very triad-oriented. It was the root, third, and fifth notes that gave them such strong, distinctive character and a powerful melody. If we want to get fancier, we can add a 4th chord tone to turn our triad into a 7th chord, which gives us the sound of more modern styles of jazz. Our chord tones would then be 1, 3, 5, and 7, giving us a D minor 7, a G7, and a C major 7. So with our chord tone system, instead of thinking, I play the D Dorian mode over the D minor 7 chord, we're now just thinking, I play the D minor 7 chord. It cuts out the middleman and solves our mental overwhelm problem. The next benefit is that chord tones give us several anchor points other than just the root notes to orient ourselves as the chords change. If we practice transitioning from each chord tone of one chord to the closest chord tone of the following chord, it can give us many possibilities for weaving melodies seamlessly between the chords. This is the true secret sauce to sounding like a confident improviser. Now, the third benefit of chord tones is it gets us out of the modal rut playing sequentially up and down a scale, instead playing in intervals, which is far more interesting. Using our chord tone triads or 7th chords, we naturally have gaps between the notes, creating far more interest in our phrasing. We can exaggerate these gaps by playing triads and 7th chords out of sequence, which adds even more interest to our lines. You may ask, if we now have just 3 or 4 strong notes to play over each chord, what happened to the other notes from the scale? Do we heartlessly discard anything that's not a 1, 3, 5, or a 7? No. We can still use these, but because they're not as strong melodically, we tend to use them in passing between our stronger chord tones. For this reason, we call them passing tones. Now let's take a practical playing example using the common jazz turnaround, the 1-6-2-5. Our modes for this particular progression would be C Ionian for the 1 chord, A Aeolian for the 6th chord, D Dorian for the 2 chord, and G Mixolydian for the 5 chord. I'm going to play several short phrases over this progression to demonstrate the sound of the modal approach versus chord tones and passing tones. The first example is using modes, and you hear all of the issues that we've already described with that approach. The sound of running scales up and down, oriented by only the root notes as each chord changes, with no discernible melodic ideas. Here's what that sounds like. Now that was a bit of an exaggerated example, but can you hear how weak the phrasing was? We didn't really get a sense of the important notes. It was just a slew of notes from the scale, with none really being highlighted. This meant there was no real discernible melody. Now the next approach uses chord tones, keeping it simple by using just the 3 or 4 notes for each chord. Suddenly a melody jumps out, and the intervals or gaps between the notes keep things interesting. Could you hear a difference? I was limiting myself to less than a handful of notes for each chord, but suddenly an obvious melody was discernible which strongly outlined the chords underneath. Chord tones are the key to anchoring your lines with strong melody and coherence. Now in this last example, I'm using the strong chord tones of our 7th chords contrasted with passing tones to create even more interest. Okay, now I'm going to play several more practical examples, this time from a verse from the jazz standard All of Me. I'll keep it in our key of C. Again, our first approach will be modal. In this case, the modes associated with each chord in All of Me will be C Ionian for the C major chord, the 5th mode of A harmonic minor, otherwise known as Phrygian dominant mode, to go over our E7, followed by the 7th mode of the B flat melodic minor scale over the A7 chord, also known as the Superlocrian mode or the altered scale, followed by the Dorian mode for our D minor 7 chord. Have you fallen asleep yet? You hear all the same issues, linear scale playing, jumping to root notes as the chord changes. Even though the notes are technically correct, it sounds like a scale exercise instead of a true improvisation. I actually had to throw in a couple of interval jumps at the end to break up the sheer monotony of it. But here's what this absolute mess sounds like. Now by contrast, the chord tones for each chord in All of Me go as follows. I'm going to play a C major 6 over the C chord, and E7 over the E. Bonus points if you add the flat 9 in there. An A7, and then a D minor 7. Now the next example is with chord tones only. Just triads or 7th chords. Suddenly it sounds a bit more like something Charlie Christian or Django might play, with interval jumps and melody that weaves between the chords. Now the last example uses chord tones plus passing tones. I'm adding a bit of secret sauce in there as well by using some chromatic notes. Let's summarize our findings. Using modes as our foundation for improvising gives us 1. Mental overwhelm with too many things to think about at once. 2. Fretboard disorientation from trying to connect multiple scales together and jumping from root note to root note. 3. Linear up and down lines that sound like we're playing exercises. And 4. Indistinct melody with notes that don't always highlight the chords underneath. However, once we start thinking in chord tones, we have 1. Simplicity, with 3 or 4 strong notes to use instead of multiple 7-note scales. 2. Each guide tone can easily be resolved to the next chord. 3. Strong melody, because chord tones will always work over the chords they outline. And 4. Interesting intervals in our phrasing instead of the up and down lines we get from modes. If you want to learn more about how to incorporate guide tones into your playing, I have a video with a 10-minute guide tone practice here. Also, if you've been spinning your wheels with modes and feeling stuck, I'd love to hang out and get you on the right track. I've got a limited number of spots open for one-on-one sessions where I can help clear away the confusion and give you a powerful practice routine that will fit into a busy schedule and get you soloing confidently. Click the link below. So it stands to reason that chord tones are a much more beneficial focus for your practice than modes. The constant practice of these chord tone solos while experimenting with rhythms and passing tones is what eventually leads to the natural ability to improvise fluid and exciting solos. So there you have it, we've shattered the modal myth. Have you been caught up in modal mayhem? I'd love to hear about your personal frustrations learning to improvise in the comments below. Meanwhile, see you soon, Jazzers. So we've now looked at the basic formula that our jazz heroes will use to learn their craft. Instead of chord tones, boo.